The climate projections that were made even in the 1960s, frankly,
Mhm.
were unbelievably accurate.
Accurate.
Even if the United States were to respond to climate change, it wouldn't matter because India and China won't. If only natural cycles were at play right now, those natural cycles are at play and they would have the planet cooling. But in fact, the planet is warming at a terrifying pace. A country that was founded on principles of democracy and worked as hard as it could to try to spread democracy around the globe. Not only will America suffer, the whole world will suffer. Top three top of mind associations, none of them are
Yeah.
personally engaging. And that, again, that is indicates strongly to me that we have a failure to communicate here. Lots and lots of hospitals, healthcare systems are in the US and certainly worldwide are incredibly vulnerable to climate impact. How do we make the invisible visible? Is through better communication, through by prioritizing communicating the risks.
Mhm.
That climate change is a public health problem, and
Problem.
that climate solutions will create public health benefits.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Science Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Muhammad Itafaq. Today, I am honored to have another guest. His name is Dr. Edward Maibach. He is a university professor as well as a former director of Mason Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. Dr. Maybach is a fellow of the AAAS. He's also a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He has also honored with being named as among the world's 10 most influential climate scientists by Thomson Reuters. Previously, he has also worked as associate director of the National Cancer Institute and currently serving on the board of directors of the Global Climate and Health Alliance. Dr. Ed, welcome to Science Talk and thank you for your time today.
Oh, Mohammed, so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor, and I love talking science. So let's get down to it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, my first question, what is the biggest myth you have heard about climate change?
Holy smokes, there are so many. Wow. Okay, I'm gonna go with this one.
Okay.
Um, that if the even if the United States were to respond to climate change, it wouldn't matter because India and China won't. And wow, that is such a multifaceted myth, and it's just flat out wrong on every level. I mean, China is good for them. China is eating our lunch in terms of steering their economy into the prosperity of the 21st century,
Yeah.
whereas we are running away from the economy of the
Yeah.
21st century and, frankly, furthering the lead that China has developed over the past decade or two. So I think that's a really crucial myth that warrants our trying to debunk that one in any and every possible way we can.
Yeah, they're already doing too much, and it's interesting because when I talked with Dr. Peter Kalmus, his work in NASA climate scientist and very strong advocate of climate policies. He exactly used the same phrase, saying that China is eating our lunch. So I'm glad that you brought that up too, because they're already trying to phase out from fossil fuel. Not entirely, but they're also building coal plants, but they're also doing a lot of renewable energy. Over the last few years. So
Yeah, and
another. Mhm.
I just want to clarify.
Yeah,
I don't begrudge China for eating our lunch. It's like they are more far-seeing than we are. They made
yeah,
investments, strategic investments, beginning 2 decades ago and
yeah,
really doubling down a decade ago. And good, it's good for them, and it's frankly good for every single person on the planet.
yeah,
So I actually credit them with being, having smart leadership that is investing in the energy sources of and the technologies of the future, as opposed to doubling down on the ones of the past, which have long outlived their usefulness.
yeah. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So is our climate changing?
Oh yeah, faster and faster all the time. My friend Naomi Oreskes, the science historian at Harvard, she talks about climate scientists as operating under the principle of least drama,
Mhm.
meaning they are inherently conservative because they don't ever want to make projections that prove to have been overly concerning
Yeah.
because they worry that doing so would undermine their credibility. But it,
Mhm.
it means they err on the side of underestimating climate impacts. And what we've seen consistently year over year, well, not really fair to say year over year, but over time, we have seen that the climate projections that were made even in the 1960s, frankly,
Mhm.
were unbelievably accurate.
Accurate.
And
Mhm.
if anything, they were underestimating the extent to which the climate would have changed by now. And so what we're actually seeing is the rate of climatic change is increasing. The impacts it's not a steady state increase, it is an accelerating increase, which it certainly terrifies me and I think would terrify anybody who really understands the implications of that.
And recently, when I posted a couple of videos, some people throw that myth as well. They say, like, climate is always changing. We have nothing to do. It's a natural cycle. So I just want you to address that as well. Why is it changing?
Well, it's true that the climate has always changed, and B, that is profoundly misleading because the time scale in which climate has changed in the past, we have accelerated it. It's sort of like the Spinal Tap metaphor, right? And in Spinal Tap, they had the amplifier that its maximum level was 11 on when in fact the volume can only go to 10. I'm not sure I have that right. It's been a long time since I've seen Spinal Tap. But the point being that we have so amplified the rate of
Yeah.
climate change. And unlike the natural processes that have played out in a cyclical manner over many, many millennia in the past, this time it's human activity that is not only driving most of the change, and that change is happening much, much faster than ever before. It's in fact driving all of the change because if natural cycles were only natural cycles were at play right now, those natural cycles are at play and they would have the planet cooling. But in fact, the planet is warming at a terrifying pace.
Yeah.
So that, while it's true that the climate has always changed, it's grossly misleading.
Misleading. Thank you for addressing that. So I'm going to start a little bit bigger conversation, moving away from these fundamental basic questions. Is that what is wrong with America? I just want you to unpack that, whatever level you want it, individual level, institutional level, or whatever you feel it needs to be addressed. But like at this moment, at this point of time, if somebody, I mean, like, there are a lot of people looking at the US and just asking that question, what is wrong with the US?
Oh, Mohammed, that is so above that question. Answering that question is so above my pay grade. It's obviously incredibly complicated, and I'm not a political scientist,
Mhm.
but it is obvious. I mean, it should be obvious to every person on the planet that something is deeply wrong with the US right now. We have, we have moved from a country that was once not so long ago a beacon, a shining beacon on the hill, a beacon of hope
Yeah,
for the world,
absolutely.
a country that was founded on principles of democracy and worked as hard as it could to try to spread democracy around the globe. Not a perfect country by any means, marred by all kinds of missteps, ideological and political and otherwise. But generally speaking, a pretty solid citizen of the globe.
Mhm.
And right now, we are not being that solid citizen of the globe anymore. And how we got here it's really, as I said, it's above my pay grade. I do think that the politicization of all of news sources in America has taken us from being a country that was unified despite understanding its problems and its opportunities in different ways, to being a country that is fractured fundamentally and along an identity fault line, such that we now whichever side of that fault line we are on, we tend to see the people on the other side of that fault line as not only the other, totally unlike us, but completely at in opposition to everything that we hold dear. And
Mhm.
so we've made enemies of each other along this fault line. And I do think, social media has played a role. Certainly, traditional news media has played a role. Funding of, political parties and ideologies has played a role. That there are so many things, but boy, the only thing that's really clear to me, the only thing I believe with absolute certainty is that if we don't learn to think like a nation again, one nation that has a purpose in the world, frankly, the whole, not only will America suffer, the whole world will suffer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the phrase goes like, if America sneezes, the whole world catches the flu, you know? So it's that kind of a situation. But I think it's a good time maybe to like kind of talk a little bit if we think about the bigger picture, like what is wrong with America, but like specifically if we think about climate change, health, and science. And the science advancements over the last few decades have made America, the most wealthiest country on the planet, and like the most powerful country on the planet because of this research and development. We have these institutions, right? So you have done work in all these sectors. In health sector, you have worked in academia. You have also worked in, you love science. Where are we getting a little bit wrong on science and climate specifically? I'll talk a little bit more about health later, but like right now, start us from the science, which is umbrella term here.
Yeah. Again, a complicated question, but this one does speak to my area of expertise.
Yes.
And I'm going to reflect back on the polling that I've been doing with my dear friend and colleague Tony Leiserowitz at Yale.
Mhm.
Our team at George Mason and his team at Yale, we've been conducting the climate change in the American mind polls
Mhm.
every 6 months since the fall of 2008.
Oh,
And
wow. It's been 17 years. Yeah.
the purpose of these polls is basically to figure out, well, what do Americans understand about about climate change? What do they misunderstand about climate change? What kinds of do they see it as a personally relevant threat? Do they see it as a threat to their community, to their state, to our nation, to the people of the world?
Yeah.
What, if anything, are they doing about it, and would they like to do about it? And perhaps most importantly, what, if anything, would they like to see us as a nation do about it?
Do about
Because,
it.
ultimately, this is a collective action. Climate change is a collective action
Yes,
problem.
absolutely.
And it's so important that all of us do our part, but we can all do our part. And if we don't have climate smart policies on the books of our nation, of our states, and of our communities, what's most going, the biggest thing that we're going to lose is our own collective well-being. So we absolutely need smart climate policies on the books. So that's why we conduct these surveys. And I would say the most important thing that we learned in our very first survey, and we continue to relearn and to better appreciate over time, is that most Americans do understand or accept the reality that our climate is changing.
Mhm.
Fewer, but still a majority, understand that it's human activity. It's the burning of fossil fuels. It's the cutting down of the world's forests that are the primary drivers of the climate change. But most Americans, even those who are really concerned about it, tend to see it as a distant problem.
They don't
Distant.
see the immediate problem. Yeah.
Right. So they see it as distant in time, like 2050, 2100, not 2025. They see it as distant in space, you know,
Deep in the ocean. Yeah.
Bangladesh, but yes, but Boston, no.
Yeah.
And ultimately, and perhaps most profoundly, seriously, they see it as distant in terms of species.
Mhm.
Plants, penguins, and polar bears, absolutely, but people, not so much. So, before we ask any other questions in our surveys about global warming, and we do tend to say global warming as opposed to climate change, but before we ask any other question about global warming, we ask this question. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the words global warming?
Mm.
And they give us open-ended answers,
Yeah.
top of mind association.
Mhm.
And the most common top of mind association is essentially polar bears, right? Plants, penguins, and polar bears, the environment, species in our environment that are not us.
Yeah.
And while it is understandable why that is the top of mind association, it isn't particularly helpful because it isn't particularly engaging. You
Mm.
know, let's just say 7 out of 10 Americans are polar bear friends of polar bears,
Yeah.
but they see them. They don't
Yeah.
coexist with polar bears.
Mhm.
They don't live in their communities. Maybe there's one or two in the zoo,
Yeah.
but it isn't to know something is a threat to polar bears is very different than to know something is a threat to your own health and well-being, the health and well-being of your children and grandchildren, the health and well-being of your neighbors, your community members,
Mhm.
your
Yeah.
fellow, members of your nation, and
Yeah.
to people of the world. So that really is the fundamental challenge that we face.
Mm.
Most people accept the realities of climate change, but they see it as a distant threat. And that ultimately, I would contend, is a communication failure, right? What we have here is a failure to communicate the human health, the human relevance of
Yeah.
climate change, as opposed to the environmental relevance of climate change, or the scientific relevance of climate change, which is actually the second most common top of mind association, something to do with science, like the
Mhm.
Keeling curve that shows the increase in carbon dioxide at the top of a mountain in Hawaii.
Mhm.
Well, it's great that people tell us that their top of mind association is the Keeling curve,
Yeah.
but again, that sort of suggests it's not a personally relevant problem to them. And the third most relevant association that we get in an answer to that question is politics and politicians.
Yeah.
And when we look at the other answers that they give us later in the survey, we know, for example, that when they say Democrats or Al Gore or Barack Obama,
Yeah.
what they're really telling us is it's the other that I talked about previously. It's
Yeah.
quote unquote the other.
Other.
And so when they say that their top of mind association is the other, what they're really telling us is this isn't really a problem, or
Mm.
it's a problem caused by people whose values I reject, and therefore I'm not going to concern myself with this
Yeah.
problem. So the top three
Agree.
top of mind associations, none of them are
Yeah.
personally engaging. And that, again, that is indicates strongly to me that we have a failure to communicate here.
Wow, that is very concise and precise. Over the last 17 years of work you guys have been doing, and that is amazing. And when I talked with Matt last week, he also brought up these things. But you mentioned that overall distance problem, and I want to mention that, like, the distant problem is like, yeah, it's maybe happening somewhere, coral reefs happening somewhere deep in the ocean, what it has to do something, people living in North Carolina, or Texas. So is that, you think, because we have a climate modeling where we project things how they are going in 2050, 2100? Do you think that it is because that modeling is always like 50 to 60 years in advance, and people seeing it, oh, they're projecting it's gonna, increase 3 degree by 2100, and I'm like, 50 years old, who cares what is gonna happen, because I'm not gonna be here. Do you think is that the problem with the projection, or how do we, kind of estimate those conservative estimates we share with them, communicate with them like, hey, it is a problem, but it's not a problem which is going to affect you now or in next 5 years? Is it like, I just want to understand or want you to unpack that a little bit, that like the communication, where we are failing to communicate that what the data we have, people are not being like kind of getting relatable to that problem. Is it because of the communication, or the media is telling the story like that, or is it a scientist who are predicting through these models that these changes are going to happen in a certain period of time?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. There's the communication part.
Mhm.
Well, actually, let's start with the science part. There is the science to model what different future scenarios look
Yeah.
like. And that science tends to look 50 and 100 years out.
Mhm.
Because the nature of climate is almost, by definition, the average of the weather conditions over a
Mhm.
30-year period or longer.
Yeah.
So climate models are specifically, created to look at what the climate of the future will bring,
Yes.
not on, January 1 of 2028,
Yeah.
but, over a multi-decadal period. So that's just the way climate science
It
works.
works.
And it's inherently future oriented, although it can
Absolutely.
also go look retrospectively at the climate of the past. And frankly, I think more focus on that science and demonstrating how the climate of today
Mm.
is different in harmful ways than the climate of the not so distant past. The
Yeah.
climate, I myself am, older than you, so my life has been longer. And if you looked back over the climate I grew up in, let's just say in the 1960s,
Mhm.
1970s, it is considerably different than the climate of today.
Yeah.
And more of a focus on that and looking at the impacts of that climate change that's happened in my lifetime, or in
Mhm.
your lifetime,
Yeah.
or even in my children's lifetime, whose lifetime is shorter yet again than yours. I think that would be helpful because it will bring a human context to
Mhm.
climate change and help bring it into the present and take it more out of the future. Not that future projections aren't helpful, they are, but if when people are only getting the future projections and not understanding the current impacts, it tends to lead to a distorted view of climate change as a distant problem. And then there's one more element here, and that is until one of the state-of-the-art tasks in climate science right now is what they call downscaling, looking at the current impacts of climate change in my community and in your community and in communities all over the world. Climate models have tended to, in the past, climate models have been most reliable looking at large land scale projections. So in the southeast of the United States, for example, the models work pretty well in explaining the climate of the southeast. How well do they work at explaining the climate of Harrisonburg, Virginia? Not so well.
Yeah.
But that is exactly what many climate scientists are trying to do right now, improve the downscale models so that if you are a resident of Harrisonburg, Virginia, and you want to know what the climate was 50 years ago, as opposed to today, and what the most likely scenario is 50 years from now, you'll have a reasonably, valid and reliable data
Yeah.
or answer to that question.
Yeah. Perfect. So if people do not, kind of see that as an immediate problem, or I think they do understand, the literacy is on that level that they do understand a little bit about climate change and it's happening because I saw the recent spring 2025 report, Climate Change in the American Mind, saying that almost 70, 8 or 80%, or some survey shows 89% people believe is changing, right? So if we are there, how do we expect people to understand the impacts of climate change on their health until they do not see it as an immediate problem to them, or like if they're living in, the intense heat areas, like, in Arizona, or in Texas, or some parts of Florida. What do you think of that? That how would you respond that if they do not understand the basics of climate change, how do we expect them to understand the impacts of that on their health and well-being?
Yeah. It's such a good question. And I'm actually going to reflect back on a story that I've heard from one of my mentors, Bill Novelli, a father of the field of social marketing. Uh, So I don't know if this story is true or totally apocryphal, but it doesn't really matter. It makes the point I want to make. He talks about if you're a gardener, you know about Burpee's seeds, the Burpee Seed Company. It's one of the big seed companies here in the U.S. and every gardener knows about Burpee
Yeah.
seeds. And as the story goes, Mr. Burpee, back in the latter part of the 19th century, Mr. Burpee, as he was starting to build his company up and try to convince Americans to plant lawns,
Yeah.
because before then Americans didn't have lawns, but the
Yeah.
British had lawns. But at any rate, Mr. Burpee, his company was all about lawn seed, and he apparently trained his sales staff. He told them in the following. He said, "Don't talk to your customers about our seeds. Talk to them about their lawns."
Hmm.
And there's such a deep insight, whether it's true or not, there's a deep
Yeah.
insight into that. It's like, okay, you've got to meet people where they are.
Where
You've
they
got to
are. Yeah.
start conversations about what people care about,
Yeah.
not what you
You
care
care
about.
about. Yeah.
And climate scientists care deeply about the climate, as do
Mhm.
I, and many other Americans and people of the world care deeply about the climate. But it's an abstraction. It's a
It
scientific
is.
abstraction, and ordinary people, it doesn't mean all that much to them.
Yeah.
So if we want to do a better job sharing what the scientists know about climate change and about what we can do to try to minimize it or stop it,
Mhm.
we have to do a better job of talking to people about the things they care most about.
Mhm.
Um, I'm a health professional. I've been a public health professional for 40 plus years now. So I care deeply about health, but I'm happy to say that so do most other people on the planet. We do care about health. So a
Mhm.
conversation led by or initiated by health professionals
Mhm.
talking about the human health impacts of our changing climate and about the human health benefits of climate solutions.
Mhm.
That's a good conversation to have.
To have. Yeah.
And it's a good conversation to have because it's not talking about our seeds. It's talking about our patients' lawns, if you will. It's
Mhm.
talking about something they care deeply about, their health, the health of their children, the health of their community members, their loved ones. And that is a conversation that at our center, Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason, we're
Mhm.
working really hard to jumpstart those conversations, to
Mhm.
organize health professionals around the country, to give them the information they need to more fully understand the health impacts of climate change and the health benefits of climate action so that they can start these conversations. Maybe with their patients, although, being a clinician is a tough business because you
It is.
you have patients stacked up all
Yes.
day long. They're in the waiting room
Yeah.
there, and the more time they spend with me, for
Yeah.
example, talking to me about climate and health, the more their other patients who are waiting in the waiting room will be irritated with them. So, their climate change does exacerbate certain illnesses
Yeah.
and health
Absolutely.
conditions, and that clinicians should be talking about their patients about that with patients who have relevant conditions. Asthma, for example,
Yeah.
air pollute, bad air quality days, asthma patients should do everything they can to minimize their exposure to the air pollution. Extreme heat days, which
Absolutely.
often coincide with bad air quality
Yeah.
days. Asthma patients should be extra cautious during those events. And so for asthmatic patients, it really does help when your doctor talks to you about, hey, the climate is changing. We're getting more bad air quality days. We're getting more extreme heat waves. You, as a person with asthma, you need to be extra careful
Mhm.
about, what you do and when you do it on days that are extremely hot and/or have extremely bad air quality.
Absolutely. Or if your patients are elderly and it's hot, it's a hot summer, hotter than last 20 years, and you have to talk with them how to get dehydrated, how to be in the cooler areas, not to go outside and like limit their exposure. Absolutely. But like, are we teaching these public health professionals or doctors about climate change in public health school or medical schools?
Not nearly enough,
Hmm.
but the shortest possible answer is yes.
Hmm.
The slightly longer answer is yes, but it's really just getting underway now. And there are all kinds of organizations who are working with medical schools, who are working with nursing schools, who are working with schools of public health to make sure that every one of those students becomes really proficient
Mhm.
in, thinking about understanding the human health relevance of climate change and what can be done to try to mitigate or to try to help people be resilient to those impacts so that they aren't needlessly hurt.
Absolutely. So, the health risks of extreme weathers, such as flooding or hurricanes, are consequential, right? Like the diseases which are going to be vector-borne diseases after those floodings and hurricanes. And first of all, it's going to hit people who are elderly, who do not have health insurance, or more vulnerable communities. But like, is overall, you have worked in the public health sector and you're also surveying these public health officials. Overall, if we think about America's health system, there's a local and state health departments, right? There's a local and state environmental or climate environmental departments. Then we have hospital systems. Then we have insurance companies. Then we have, pharmaceutical companies. Then we have med schools or public health schools. In terms of infrastructure or in terms of readiness, do you think the American health system is getting into that direction where we need to go in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change? Is there like a bigger realization at the state or national level that we need to move into this direction?
Yes and yes. And in other words, um, both our healthcare delivery system, that would
Mhm,
be hospitals and clinics and individual practices, are incredibly vulnerable to climate impacts.
mhm,
And when we have a climate impact, like unfortunately they are about to have a major climate impact crashing down on Jamaica in
mhm,
the form of a Category 5 hurricane, that is when you need your health system to be up and running and at peak capacity, because that's when people are having their health harmed as a result of the climate impact. Um, the lots and lots of hospitals, healthcare systems in the US and certainly worldwide are incredibly vulnerable to climate impact. So we need to make them more resilient to those impacts, which means we need to understand what those impacts are likely to
all
be.
right,
We
yes.
need to strengthen them, to harden them, to prepare for those impacts so that they are at peak operational capacity when they are most needed. So yes, we have a problem. Yes, the by and large, the people who run American healthcare systems, including the public health system, they understand that we have a problem and they are starting to move in the right direction, but they are in very early days
Mhm.
of really doing the analysis of
Yeah.
what the specific vulnerabilities
All
for a
right.
specific hospital or hospital system are, and planning on what they can do about it to become more resilient. And above and beyond that, also deciding what they can do to become less of the problem themselves. In other
Mhm.
words, decarbonizing their own healthcare system, moving away from burning fossil fuels to help treat sick patients and moving towards running their entire operation on clean, healthful energy sources. So all of this is in process. It's in the early days. We have a lot of hard work to do.
Hard work to do. So one of the things Jeff also mentioned that the impacts of climate change on heat or other things on our vulnerable communities are invisible. Like, these hot conditions, you can't kind of see or touch, like, oh, because the weather is hot this summer. And that's why I'm getting this sickness or developing this some sort of, sickness or disease. How do we make them more visible, talk with, at any level? Where those conversations need to happen that we make these impacts of these climate change calamities on your health more visible?
Such a good question. And Jeff is absolutely right. They do tend to be invisible.
Mhm.
And you are absolutely right. Visible, we tend to be more concerned about and more likely to take action to address
Mhm.
visible rather than invisible problems. So, certainly heat is invisible, largely invisible.
Mhm.
Even bad air quality, until it gets
Exactly.
extremely bad. It's largely invisible. I'm sure you and I have both been in a place and not realized how bad the air quality was until we
Absolutely.
got in an airplane above the city and
Yeah.
we saw, oh my God, there's a brown haze that is
Yes.
enveloping the city we just
Yes.
took off from. So that's largely invisible. One impact that is extremely visible and probably unforgettable for anybody who's ever experienced it is wildfires,
Mhm.
right? The people who had their communities leveled in the
Yeah.
Palisades and in Altadena in the Los Angeles region,
Yep.
they will never forget it. I actually spent some time this summer in Boulder, Colorado, where a fire, a couple of
Yeah.
New Year's Eves, a fire ripped through their community and burned 1,000 houses.
Yeah.
Both people will never forget the impacts that they experienced.
Mhm.
But we don't want them to have to experience it in order for them to understand the
Yeah.
risks and to take action. And so I think the answer to your question about how do we make the invisible visible is through better communication, through by prioritizing communicating the risks, by using visual imagery, showing, for example, what how community American and communities around the world that have been devastated by
Yeah.
wildfires, people who are incredibly profoundly sickened
Yeah.
by heat waves.
Yeah.
And one a pet peeve of mine and one of that I probably you share as well as a climate communicator is um, news coverage of heat waves that show children playing in public fountains,
Yes,
as
absolutely.
a
Or
way
a
to keep
beach, or
cool,
picture
or
images from
or
a
beach.
beach. Yeah.
Right, right. It's
Yeah.
understandable that journalists, that photo editors want to represent a heat wave by showing people, what they do during a heat
Yeah.
wave. But that's totally minimizing,
Yeah.
the opportunity to explain just how dangerous this is, not just for the elderly, as you mentioned, but
Mhm.
also for young children, for
Yeah.
babies in particular, for people who have chronic illnesses,
Yeah.
for young people who are student athletes and military recruits who are in basic training,
Mhm.
all for outdoor workers, farm
Yeah.
workers.
Yes.
All of these people are at profound risk during extreme heat waves. And I would like to see our news organizations do a better job of capturing that through visual imagery, as opposed to showing people having a nice time at the beach or dancing around in a public fountain somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you see people like at the beach, people, it's like, okay, maybe I should go too. They don't think about this heat because they're there because the heat problem. They think about, oh, maybe I'm missing something. I should go there too. Couple of things. I think one of the things like last year was the last year, yeah, 2024, when the Palisades in California, those wildfires happened, and then a couple of years ago in Colorado, and you see those images, they're devastating. And I was thinking like these people's houses are gone. Where are they gonna go? Like, can they move somewhere else? Like, how likely the scenario is that if my house is gone and I have two, three children, I would move out of state, go somewhere else, and start a new life. It's a very less likely scenario because you have a family members, you have relatives, you have community there, your kids go to certain school, they have friends. It's not very easy. And then insurance is another problem, like, are they going to cover if you live certain parts of California or certain parts of Colorado or certain parts of Texas, right? That's another layer of problem for like those poor or ordinary people. It's not easy to move. Other thing, it reminds me that yes, absolutely, I lived at least 20 years literally breathing in that air, and the last year it was 1175 AQI in my city where I was living. And I never realized that it's because like you get itchy eyes, you get rashes, you like have heart problem like breathing. We never realized it's because of air pollution. And now when we see like literally one of the city gone more than 2000 AQI in Pakistan, and it's like, just imagine living your whole life in that city, and you absolutely going to live at least 10, 15 years, less life than ordinary people who are breathing a little bit better air quality. So absolutely, I did not see that invisibility or impacts of that. So just kind of another question related to that. You have recently worked with policymakers. Are they understanding the impacts of climate change on health? Where are we with that in terms of when we think about policies?
Yeah, another great question. Some I was given the opportunity by the Wellcome Trust in the UK to organize a team in a research team in multiple countries to
Mhm.
do a multi-country study of this very question. To
Mhm.
what degree do policymakers and other policy elites, people who are in the
Mhm.
close orbit to
Yes.
policymakers, to what degree do they understand that climate policy should also be health policy, and that
Mhm.
health policy should also be climate policy? Because if we get that climate and health policies, if each of those silos of policy considers the benefits of to the other part, health policy benefiting the
Right.
climate, climate policy benefiting health. We
Okay.
are likely to move much faster, much
Absolutely.
further in
Mhm.
addressing these problems. We
Mhm.
know the science is perfectly clear on the truth of that proposition, but what wasn't clear is, well, to what degree do policymakers understand that? So we approached collaborators in six other countries or regions. So the Caribbean was one of the regions. Um, Germany, the UK, India, Brazil, and blanking on one. How embarrassing, but I'll just go right
Don't
past it.
worry. Mhm.
So each of these, we created a common research protocol, in-depth interviews, interviewing policymakers and other people who are close to policymakers to
Okay.
find out what they know. And by and large, what we learned is that yes, there was a high degree of general awareness
Mhm.
that climate change is a public health problem,
Problem.
and that climate solutions will create public health benefits.
Mhm.
But by and large, these policymakers were reporting relatively modest progress
Mhm.
towards integrating these two areas of policy. And they pointed at all kinds of extremely mundane but important reasons for that progress. One reason was what they said were the silos. We've got a Ministry of Health, and
Mhm.
we've got a Ministry of the Environment, and maybe
Yes.
we've got a Ministry of Energy.
And we have
And
Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan. We have a Ministry of Climate Change separately.
right. And
Yes.
so they're not these ministries aren't talking to each other, which
Mhm.
means policymakers are essentially having to intervene to try to, create the interlinkages
Yeah.
between these various parts of government.
Yeah.
And they said the same seems to be true of the scientific community that, should be feeding into these government ministries. You got the climate scientists who talk to other climate scientists, and you've
Yes.
got the health scientists who talk to other health scientists. They're saying we don't see the kind of robust conversation between the climate science community and
Yeah.
the health science community that would help us address the siloization
Issue.
problem.
Mhm. So, and that's where we are in terms of, how much they understand policies
Yeah.
related to climate and health.
Quick timeout. Kenya was the other country involved in our
Awesome. Yes.
collaboration.
There you go. In
Sorry, I
Africa.
just
No,
I just couldn't leave that hanging.
no,
That once it came
absolutely.
to mind, I had to
Absolutely.
give it to you.
Great. Great. Thank you. So, let's talk a little bit about science in the US more particularly. Um, do we just not like science in general? Or is it just like right now it's a bad time for science?
We actually Scientists are highly trusted in countries around the world. I
Yes.
was
And you,
just
you, you
involved.
just have research the study from
Yeah.
68 countries. Yes.
68 countries. We did research in 68 countries to study public opinion
Yes.
about science and scientists and, science in general and climate
Mhm.
science in specific. And by and large, scientists are highly trusted and science is highly valued,
Mhm.
but um, it isn't uniform. There are people in every country who distrust scientists. They distrust climate scientists in many countries more than they distrust scientists in general, although there are some countries where they distrust scientists in general more than they distrust climate scientists,
Mhm.
curiously enough. But the broader truth here is that we value science. The public values science in all 68 countries, and I would probably imagine it's true in almost every country in the world.
Mhm.
But science science scientists tend to be more comfortable speaking to each other
Yes.
rather than speaking to the public.
Public.
Science reporting often tends to adopt the jargon, the technical terms of science, the
Yes.
science they're reporting on, as opposed to translating it into lay terms. Um, so there is some vulnerability, and when there are accusations against science or scientists,
Yes.
or science organizations, universities, for example, when there are allegations that, hey, they're playing fast and loose with the truth, or
Yes.
they are in bed with ideological
Yes.
forces in our community that are pushing, that are distorting or warping what the scientists are telling us, that it leaves the science community vulnerable to growing distrust. So in the during the pandemic, for example, here in the US and in other countries where these surveys have been done, health professionals felt like they were losing the trust of the public. But polling actually showed that in the earlier days of the pandemic, actually trust in climate science, in health science, in health professionals was at an all-time high
I. Mhm.
because the public saw these health professionals rallying and
Yes.
doing epic, heroic job of
Right.
protecting us. It has settled down a bit as motivated ideological sources have pointed a finger at the health community, and the same is true, by the way, of the climate science community.
Mhm.
The public tends to have relatively high trust in scientists in general and in climate scientists, but we aren't invulnerable to attack. When we are accused of doing wrong things, it can undermine public trust in us.
Absolutely.
But that means it's all the more important for us when we are being accused
Mhm.
to explain that while sometimes it's true, mistakes are made,
Yep.
generally speaking, science and scientists are the best police force on what science does because science is a self-policing enterprise.
Mhm.
We scientists, we actually earn credit when we catch other scientists doing quote unquote bad science.
Yes.
It's one of the ways where we actually bolster our own credibility. So rather than hiding our mistakes, we
Mhm.
are motivated to find our mistakes, our collective mistakes, expose them so that we move beyond them and we do only good science or more good science going forward.
Absolutely. Two things you mentioned is that the science and the scientists do not interact or engage with the public at large. They talk with each other, but they don't talk with the general public. Is that because there is no incentive? Because it's add-on work. Like, for example, you're sitting here with me, or I'm taking the time out and doing this and putting out and asking people to talk to me and doing the outreach work, but there is no incentive in a tenure track system, in the overall academia, and overall for other things. Is that the problem, or do you think it's just how the hierarchy or the setup of these academic institutions that you are a professor, you're hired to do teaching load or produce some research and like stays in your desktop, you get some Google Scholar citations and you move on and live your life? Or if you take it to the public, of course you have to have a thick skin because people are going to attack you. People who do not like the work you do, they are going to find ways to malign you or to attack you, and nobody's preparing you either, and your institution is not going to defend you in many cases. Like, it does in many cases, but in other cases it doesn't. Where is the problem you see that disconnect between scientists and the public?
Yeah, all of the above and more. So, for example, it goes back to how we're trained. I don't know
Mhm.
how you were trained, but we're both trained in communication
Yes,
science.
yes.
And in my 4 years of doctoral level training in communication science, I don't believe I was given even 10 minutes of training on how to be a good public communicator.
So,
Um, and communication scientists. So if you and I weren't trained that way, maybe you were because you're younger and hopefully your faculty were had realized this is an important part of what a scientist should be doing.
Yeah.
And so hopefully you did get that training in science communication. But take go into the climate sciences or the health sciences, and those people almost certainly aren't getting systematic training in how to speak to, for example, journalists, how
Yes.
to speak to a public audience.
Mhm.
These are skills that are learnable if you are given training and feedback.
Mhm.
And I see a big generational difference between my generation and yours, and even a generation coming up behind you. With each successive generation, they are less and less concerned about the lack of incentives for
Mhm.
them as scientists and for them as academics to do this work. They
That's
still
true. That
they
that's
still
that's how
feel
I
it's important
started. So
work to
yes,
do.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's great because that shows that even though the sociology of science is lagging behind, where we need it to be, we need a science to society continuum whereby scientists feel like, okay, I'm expert in this. I really have an obligation to share what I know with members of my community, with people in my nation and the world, and specifically with policymakers who should be creating smarter public policy. Um, and even if they don't feel good at it, they should still feel an obligation to try.
Yeah.
And so I think all of what you said is true, plus this additional, we need to be preparing scientists to make this a part of their work that they feel mastery over. Because
Absolutely.
because no one likes to go to do something important badly.
Yeah, and I think that might also solve another problem we face is that when there are attacks on science and it's only scientists are defending, not the general public, because they do not understand how important it is to defend science, how important it is to have that, kind of movements or, protests or whatever other ways you want to contribute to see that, oh, I got benefit from this, a therapy or a chemotherapy because my family member has a cancer, so that's how we got into because of science, right?
Yeah.
Or my teeth, are more healthier because of these, certain products. So it's just kind of that lack of, or a disconnect between scientists and public that also kind of, aggravating the problem that we have to defend the science even though you are doing the science, but then you have to explain to people why it is important to have that.
Right now in the US, we are living in a time of retribution by very powerful politicians. And that retribution or the fear of retribution is creating a climate silence like we have never seen before. People People who normally were expert, we had every reason to want to hear what they had to say about climate change and, potential climate solutions. They are feeling intimidated by
Yeah,
the potential for retribution. So
absolutely.
there has always been a climate silence in America because of the acrimony built into, those people who reject the realities of the problem versus those people who are, apoplectically concerned about the problem. Most Americans were in the middle of that continuum, and they tended to not want to talk about it because they didn't want to,
Either
instigate a
side,
fight
yeah.
with people on either side. But right now, and that was sort of an organic thing that was dampening climate conversation in America. But right now, we've got a political overlay. That is really, really deeply problematic. That is
Absolutely.
creating that is causing many people who otherwise would be talking about it, otherwise would be sharing their concerns about the threat, to be completely silent for fear of personal or professional retribution. And that is just a development that ultimately is moving our country in the wrong direction at an unbelievably fast pace.
Absolutely. So one last question before you walk your dog. So what is, I ask every one of my guests that what is one thing we are not talking about climate change and we should be spending more time talking?
It's really that what we started about where we started this conversation, the fact that the economy of
Hmm.
the 21st and 22nd century is going to be a clean energy economy. Period.
Hmm.
End of story. There's no uncertainty about that. The only uncertainty, there's two uncertainties about it. One is who's going to benefit, which national economies are going to benefit from
Benefit.
that and
Mhm.
which are essentially going to be left behind. And for a while, it looked like the American economy was positioned to benefit from it. And right now, we're running away from that. And so it looks like we are being left behind. So that's one uncertainty. Can we turn that around? And the
Mhm.
other uncertainty is how much harm have we done to human health and well-being, to our longevity, to other life forms, to other species that we care about, to the ecosystems on which all life depends. How much will we have harmed it before the inevitable happens, which is that we finally complete the transition from a dirty fossil fuel-based economy to a clean, healthful, renewable energy-based economy. The faster we move, the faster we benefit all life on the planet, and frankly, the faster we benefit our national economies and our personal economies. Communities where you can power your home
Yeah,
with clean
absolutely.
energy and you've got energy efficient technologies in your home, you are saving all kinds of money and you're improving your health and the health of your community. So the most important thing that we need to talk more about is the fact that we need to be doing this now, not debating whether or not it's necessary to do it all.
Do it all. Yeah, and I think for that we need to talk about the gardens, not about the seeds. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate that coming and talking to me. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.